Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Issei become a god part 4. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video and also share this video with your friends. I have created my other videos playlist, there you can watch my all videos easily, check out as well. Let's start this video. He awoke in a startled state, confusion rocked his mind and his sense of direction was little to non-existent. He was just walking back with Yusaka and a dizziness swept him away. Shortly, he was here, the ground that he found himself on was far from being soft or welcoming, in fact, it was quite the opposite. The cold ground that touched his bare skin was rough like concrete and as he lunged up, it grated his elbows like the inside of a Maui cheese grater. He ignored his pain and looked at his surroundings and he was sure he had never been in such a location before, but it was so familiar. He had remembered the labyrinth he was in previously, the darkness it contained. The feelings he had experienced there came rushing back to him, the fear of what lurked below him forced an ice-cold shiver to snake its way up his back. His mind began to put the puzzle pieces together. No, he had been here before. The place kept changing. The first time was when he passed out in the hospital. The second was shortly before he awoke at Yusaka's. He wondered at the grandeur of his situation, what did this dragon want him to see? If he was correct, that it kept changing, there was something he was missing. Was it a build-up to something bigger? At first, he only saw a drag. The second time, he was floating adrift in a black sea of infinity, where he felt both infinitely larger and infinitely smaller than a curbside-strewn pebble, whose understanding of time was less of a linear concept that lead from one event to the next, but more of a mangled, discombobulated huddle of jigsaw puzzle pieces poorly assembled by a 9-year-old who struggles to read directions. He looked up at the sky in deep thought. Stars spun and danced in circles around one another. Constellations hung so low it was almost like he could reach up and touch them, and the faint, ink-like flowing of the space between the stars made certain to show him he wasn't at a place on Earth. The group of pale stars gathered into a larger mass before dispersing across the sky in all directions, leaving behind a shimmering streak of red accented by gold flakes that burned out shortly after forming. The stars burned away before they left his view, but the streak of colors they left behind lingered and swirled in circles around the point where the stars originally gathered, forming their own mandala of twisted and stretched lines. He sighed. If he couldn't solve the situation himself, he might as well just question it. So, what is it this time, Dreg? Dreg? His eyes widened. That wasn't the voice of Dreg. It was feminine, soft almost as if the source's voice was hardly used. He snapped around, looking for the origin of the voice, but nothing was around him. It was only a flat plane that faded shortly away from where he stood. His head pounded as a discomforting feeling burned at the core of his body. Are you the new Red Dragon Emperor? Oh, this is interesting. The second voice joined, this one evidently male. Low and ancient, the voice rumbled like that of a demon. Who's there? Issei asked, fear washing over into his speech. This is annoying. I crave silence and find myself here. Office? The world serpent. Impudent little worm, you dare mistake my title for that damnable beast of Ragnarok's. His question was ignored. He looked up again, and the stars began to fade. He felt the surface he was on disappear below him, and the confusion came back to him. He felt like he was falling, and his head began to jumble. His ears rang as they strained to listen for things that weren't there. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came of his attempt. He moved his head to the left, and was immediately met with a sight that made his stomach hurt. He stood alone in a long, dark corridor. The shadows pressed against him and filled him with a bone-chilling cold. Torches lined the walls, but none of them were lit. The light that enabled him to see was something unreal for him, but despite the lack of light, shadows danced and flickered as if they were alive. There was a gentle breeze that grazed his face from the direction he was facing. He turned around as a deep chill snaked up his back and backpedaled as the darkness pressed up against him. He turned and began to run, sprinting away from the darkness that only seemed to sneak closer and closer to him with each passing step. He felt like she was in a horror movie and he was indeed scared. As he ran, he found it harder and harder to catch his breath and he was now beginning to notice that the corridors had been shrinking closer to him. He tumbled downward, almost like he fell down a few steps. He looked up and found himself in a chamber of sorts. It was almost completely empty. The only thing inside the room, aside from himself, was one enormous mirror that stretched upwards from the center of the room. He turned and looked behind him, only to come face to face with a wall. The way of him entering was gone, the breeze that flowed in the room shifted, and a power slowly rolled out from the mirror. His senses felt heightened, and his heart ached. He felt fear as he looked at the mirror. He felt alone. The fire that filled him in situations similar to this was gone. The calm he was normally gifted with was replaced with fear. Drake hadn't spoken to him, and he felt powerless here in this place. His eyes made contact at the point of the mirror where his reflection should have been, but the mirror reflected nothing. There was a darkness that surrounded the mirror, but it was the only thing in the room to approach. His mind reeled to go run, but his body moved closer, entirely against what he would have done. He approached the mirror, and slowly, a reflection appeared, almost as if it too was afraid. A single reflection stared out at him, but the reflection wasn't of him, and it wasn't of anyone he had seen before. Instead, it was of an old man. He wore a dark blue robe, swirled with designs down to his ankles. His long gray hair reached down to his lower back, only slightly peeking out from his sides. His white, almost paper white, beard hung down slightly past his chest. In his hands, he leaned down over a staff, wooden, and twisted in a strange mangled fashion. At the top of the staff was a green gem that made his heart start pounding, not in fear, but in anxiety. The green gem was encased around the wood of the staff, almost as if it grew around the orb. "Hello, my child." He looked at the man in the mirror. His smile withered, and he felt no ill intentions. His mind struggled to cope with everything around him. He closed his eyes and placed his head in the palms of his hands. He couldn't help but bellow out a low laugh. He was surely insane. "You're far from being insane, dear boy, and these aren't mirrors." "Well, they are, but they also aren't, but that's for a different time." The man's voice was low and rumbly. Issei didn't have to ask to know and understand that he was old. Very old. "Who are you? Why am I here?" Ah, there we go. Two very good questions, with two very good answers. I'm sure you'll figure out who I am, not like it will really matter in the end, because I died a long time ago, and well, you're here because I have news for you. Or more like a story for you, I suppose. Or maybe even a revelation for you. I confuse the two sometimes, but before we start, do you by any chance know what transmigration means spiritually? He knew this. He may not have been the smartest in studies, but this was something he could break down and determine the meaning. Well, migrate means to move from one location to another, and trans means to cross into, so I guess it means to move from one form into another. Very good. With spirits, it means the same. When things die, Issei, their soul often goes to heaven or hell, but then there are the in-betweens. They don't go to either heaven or hell, but instead to a waiting room called the Akashic Records. There, they fight and wait until they are reincarnated into a new body. With no memory of their past, they start over as blank states. However, sometimes the strong souls have certain problems that arise. Problems? What problems could possibly occur? And also, did you say fight? Well, the problem with the strong spirits is that sometimes they are able to talk with their reincarnate. In even rarer cases, the spirits take knowledge of their past lives with them, along with their powers, if they had any, and yes, I did say fight. The Akashic Records have gone by many names through time, the hunting grounds, purgatory, etc. It is the place where certain special people go before they enter heaven to atone for their sins, and it's where the people who have no place go to live out their eternity. Issei remained silent. He was trying to process the amount of crazy that seemed to secrete from this place. This was the crazy place, and he was a concubine to the madness. That had to be it, but his mind still puzzled at the grandeur of his situations. Everything the man had told him up to this point had gone in and out of his ears, but one thing stuck that made his head ache. It was a thought that made everything around him seem surreal, but he knew he heard correctly. It existed within Drake from host to host. If it was similar to what had happened between him and Drake, then he had to accept it. In a sense, he was speaking to himself in some strange Twilight Zone scenario. Figured it out, Issei. Don't think too hard about it. Maybe this will help. You share a soul that is attached to you as a dragon. However, the host for said dragon is selected entirely based on random drawing. In this scenario, I chose to seek you out using magic, and now that you have strengthened your hold in magic by simply using it, I can communicate with you as a spirit. The spirit realm. Ooga booga booga. Now, don't be so glum. I'm here to offer you a gift. My magic affinity, mainly. Once you become stronger in nature, I will simply disappear, and you will take my place. Or will I? I suppose only time will determine that one. Yeah. He was going insane, surely. He had passed out, and now Drake was playing a big prank on him. Besides, if this wasn't a joke, wouldn't Drake have mentioned something about his soul being shared with someone else by now? It wasn't adding up in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the worse it got. Ahem, sorry. It's been a long time since I've spoken to anyone like this. It feels kind of strange. Anyway, let's get to the story now, and the reason you are here, shall we? Issei almost jumped back when the man spoke. His voice started out as chirpy, happy, and upbeat, and changed into one of withered malice. Not only was he unprepared for the sudden change, his mind was still elsewhere, so he struggled to catch up as well. Drake? Why Drake? Gosh. The Welsh Dragon. Are you familiar with Arthurian stories? No, I know you aren't. At least not good enough. Let's start from the beginning. Long ago, before the coming of King Arthur, a mighty white dragon invaded the lands of Britain, unleashing various evils that pushed the Welsh people to the west. We were pressed between a dragon who wrought only evil and Anglo-Saxons who assaulted us from the ground, forcing us into a losing war with a titan in the sky. However, the White One never attacked our enemy, but it was all too willing to ravage us for pleasure. Issei looked straight with a serious expression. His interest was more than piqued, to say the least. He was never a fanatic for history, but the mentioning of a white dragon made him anxious, it sounded familiar, and the pounding of his heart made it obvious there was something big he was missing. He was more perplexed by how familiar everything seemed, but couldn't place a single idea on why. But where there is one strong dragon there is often another, and two strong powers often bring a new power. From the west, the day King Arthur pulled the sword from stone, the sword known as Excalibur, a new dragon emerged. The red one came, the size of a mountain, and fought the white one. The fight between the two was long and bloody, each seemed to be a perfect match for each other, but they only fought with physical prowess. When magic was involved, the white one sorely lacked, so it stole from the red one. The earth quaked from the power, and many of our men had passed out from the unnerving presence alone. The fight continued on the ground as well, but I watched from a distance, reading the Book of the Ancients. Issei curled a smile onto his face, this story was beginning to make more sense to him, but how did Drake go from a mighty dragon to what he is now? His head hurt as he tried to understand the grandeur of his new situation. The perspective of how this story was told to him made him think otherwise about it being some joke by Drake, but now his thoughts wandered to the time of the story. King Arthur. The roars of the dragon struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest of men, but Arthur, still only barely an adult, only seemed to be empowered by it as did I. I delved into the arcane arts then, drawing 5 centric circles on the floor in a tower we had made into a command post, not knowing what would happen, and not understanding at the time that the book with its black cover was something that no one should have ever read. That night I broke something that would change everything, for the rest of time as I knew it. It was for only a few seconds that everything around me froze, the dragons stopped their fight for domination, and grew interested in the most important thing that I had destroyed. Merlin. The name came to him. He vaguely remembered the legends and myths of the legendary wizard, but there was hardly any information on him to be read. Everything about him was shrouded in mystery, but everything linked to Arthurian legends demanded his existence to be real. He was the pivotal point that set the stories all into motion after the fall of King Uther Pendragon. For 15 seconds, it was as if time had been stretched in front of me. I focused on a future that hadn't come to be and saw it all. I saw futures that weren't mine to see, I saw the past, I saw chaos beyond anything imaginable, but there is one thing, one place where no one is allowed to ever visit. Not because of what it can do to the world, no, no, no. Time is fickler than that. That one thing that I learned the hard way is this, you must never visit the time of your death early. What happens? Issei finally asked. He wanted to know, but at the same time he feared to know. It felt almost like he was breaking the ultimate rule. Once you see it early, that's it. You die. There was a ringing in my ears as that noise I was born with, that noise you and I learned to drown out and not listen to, burned out. The sound of drums that you had been so familiar with vanishes. You are stuck between one heartbeat and your last. The silence that even Office would fear. So, what choice do you make when you are walking, but dead? You go back to fix it. 10 seconds had passed and I had seen hundreds of years. I went back to the time I started it all, and death followed me until I saw my own lifeless body become a reality I wouldn't have ever imagined. I went back further and further, bringing my own demise each time. He didn't know what to say. It was like he forgot to speak. The story was jumbled and hard to understand, and he didn't know how to make sense of it. He couldn't even imagine himself being in such an outlandish situation, nonetheless, how to escape it. But that was only what happened first. That reality is long gone and never will it be seen again. I went back to a time where I hadn't existed and followed the same path, trying to create a near-perfect and identical future. So what changed then? Well, I did. My entire life as I had once known it changed. My heartbeat was back, yes, but when I sent myself back, I simply existed. I had no discernible origin, I existed without ever being created, a product of time. An ontological paradox. Though I kept the story the same each time, my parents, who never gave birth to me, met an untimely demise, but I wrote them down in my book regardless. So that's the reason we know nothing about you? Everything about you is shrouded in mystery, and it's all because you played time to keep your life? Issei questioned, using what he had gathered from the man. Ah, so figured me out, I see. Basically, yes. I lived my life like normal, became the right hand of King Uther, watched as King Arthur grew, then served him as I did his father before him. Those who dared cross me hardly lived to tell their tale, and I ascended to be known as the greatest wizard. But, for me, I had all the time in the world plus more to learn magic. So, I followed the path again, drawing those same 5 centric circles, but it was different the second time. I opened the book, but there were no words awaiting me. There was a blank page, and with it came a curse. I had power, all the power I could handle. I could see the future, even if only for a blink, but I had made something angry. Something far more ancient than God himself. His curiosity was still running rampant. There was a pressure that formed on his temples, and his heart pounded more. He had remembered seeing pictures and drawings of Merlin, writing in a book. His book of spells, and something older than God. Devils ascended from hell on earth, and angels came to meet them. War ravaged the lands, each side fought without really knowing why. They whittled away at each other's numbers, but neither side did it better than the dragons did. They cared not about who they fought, they killed both sides in tremendous numbers. I was driven to join, as if something had willed me into it. Harnessing all the magic I had come to know. Ice, fire, water, lightning, air, earth, and even void, I joined the battle without a shred of fear and turned it into a cesspool of blood with King Arthur and his men. The only magic I refused to use was time magic. It was too dangerous. I wanted to remove all evidence of it ever existing, so I refused to use it myself. After that fight, I was betrayed by my allies for power. I had written everything I had learned about magic in that book that came from a place beyond the touch of time itself. I even wrote how to harness such powers and how to create new magic from them. You said you were betrayed, and how does someone create magic? Issei asked, confusion beginning to strike him. He had only been told very basic concepts for magic. He knew his imagination played a huge role, but he thought there were only basic things he could control. He knew it was manipulating things, like fire, to his will. He remembered when he made the fire cold to the touch, but how is new magic even created? What did it even mean? Ah, yes. My allies at the time stole the book I wrote my findings and magical learnings in, but they knew better than to steal from me while I was alive. So, while we were on a mission, they dropped boulders on top of me. Many years later it was named Marlborough Mound. Beautiful place. I visited it once. I suppose I've forgotten to introduce myself, even though you figured it out already. My name is Merlin. Or, in your language, Merlin. I get the feeling knowing that will help you down the road somewhere. Issei focused particularly on the end. Something about the name he said demanded his attention. He also recalled his story from earlier. He died early. He decided to jog his memory of the story. So boulders fell on top of you, you turned into a spirit, then chose me to merge into. Why me? I mean, there were plenty of people before me, surely. Fair question. There were many others before you, Issei, but the reason I wanted to speak with you is because you are currently the weakest of the Red Dragon Emperors, but before that, another reason was because of the experiences you had before your death. Surely you can feel the power you gained, grinding at the sides of your head. You are an anomaly. Trauma in the world of the supernatural can lead to influxes of magic power, and you are no exception. The powers you have accumulated though, are similar to mine in the sense of what you can control. I want you to find my book. Learn it. Use it, and the powers I give you to create magic, and discover magic I've already found. That is unfortunately all I can do for you at the given time, and another reason for why I'm helping you. The Welsh dragon aided us in battle, so on behalf of my people, I wish to return the favor in full with extra. The White One is coming for you, and this time around, he is the stronger of the two. Descendant of Lucifer, and a human mother, the boy is a product of every star in the sky aligning, and you are his enemy. His mind worked at insane paces as he made sense of everything. He was the host of the Welsh dragon, and he was supposed to fight the White One. He hadn't even heard of a White One before, and now he was just informed he was being hunted by it. What the hell? Not only that, but he had the power of Merlin, whatever the hell that meant, and he had no idea how to even start using it. I suppose there is one last thing I request of you, Lafay Pendragon. She sides with the White One. Her older brother is Arthur, but not my king. They are not the Pendragons I have sworn my loyalty to, and are certainly not the ones King Arthur would take pride in. The descendants of King Arthur. What do you want me to do? How? To say he was now flabbergasted was an understatement. He was unaware that there were any remaining descendants of King Arthur. It wasn't something he had ever learned or heard mentioned. He had so many questions left unanswered, and his curiosity was beginning to run rampant. Open her mind. Force her to change sides. Once you get the book of mine, along with the staff here, that I'm about to hand you, she will understand her wrongdoings, surely, and if not show her the power that was used during the First War, and as a last-ditch effort, remove her from the picture. Your choice, but I would refrain from that one. His head fluttered. Remove her? He couldn't. What if she wasn't a bad person? His thought stopped progressing further. He swore to protect those around him. He wanted power to protect Yusaka, Kunu, Irina, and Zenobia, and he would be willing to do anything for it. Granted he didn't know Zenobia well at all, but she was trusted by him, nonetheless. He tilted his head down as his mind sharpened to the particular thought of not having to kill the girl. I don't have to kill her, I just have to show her the error of her ways, even if she did it for a good cause. That means I can do that by any means, right? I can't even lie to her if it helps me? He asked, a smile curling onto his face as a story began to unravel in his mind. Precisely. It is your choice. I only request you address the problem and attempt to convert her. She will be problematic eventually, and lie. Deceitful, aren't you? That's fair, all of us have done it, but I look forward to seeing how you lie. Or maybe I already know. Then, because of what you say you have done for me, I shall honor your requests. Dragon's pride. Issei had learned in only a short time the pride of a dragon was limitless, so that basically sealed it as a pact. Bold of you. A dragon's pride is everything, but you know that, don't you? Ah well. I really must be going now, a ceaseless amount of stuff to do, and everything. Ah, I almost forgot. He handed out his staff. This is my staff. Often called the staff of the Murden, you can summon it in the form that you want, and no one will ever believe it is real. But it comes with a special perk. The green gem there on top, I'm sure you felt it calling to you. It belongs to Drake. I'm sure he will recognize it as the power I stole from him after all, and with that, I must go. Until we speak again. I will be keeping tabs on you. The old man's hand reached through the portal of sorts, sending ripples like a wave outward. The staff tapped his forehead through the glass pane, and just as soon as it had tapped him, it disappeared. His head felt light, and before he could form any understanding, his vision went black. His eyes opened with a deep breath, his balance was shifted strangely in a position he didn't remember being in. He was sitting still, he knew that, but as he felt lightheaded, it was hard to focus thanks to his vision tunneling on black surroundings. After a few deep breaths in through his nose, his vision returned to him, and he could see exactly where he was at. He was resting on a bed, the same bed he had first woken up on. He turned his head to a steady sound of breathing that filled his ears. The sight before him was something he probably wouldn't forget, but Irina was fast asleep beside him. Her head rested gently on her arms as she leaned over onto the bed beside him, sitting in a chair to the side of the bed. He was halfway tempted to wake her up, but she looked too peaceful. The light shined in from a window in the room and made her seem almost angelic in a sense. Now that he had looked closer, her eyes seemed puffy and slightly red. She had been crying. Why? His ears twitched like an animal, and the movement was something that felt strange even to him. There was a voice from outside that he immediately recognized as Yusaka. He wondered why she was outside, but between the silence of her speech, he heard more and more. He heard a wind whistle, leaves rustle, and beyond that, he swore he heard a sound of weaving in the canopy. He closed his eyes, allowing his energy to focus solely on his hearing, and just as he did that, it was like his mind formed a mental map around him. Thick strands of energy pulsed through the ground around him. He could hear the heartbeat of the girl beside him, but struggled to recognize his own. In the same house, sitting at a table, he felt two people, both girls sitting at a table, and he knew them both as Zenobia and Kunu. There was no way to identify the two, but he knew it was them. Focusing even further out, he figured exactly where Yusaka was, and he discovered who it was she was speaking to. It was familiar. It was so very familiar to him. So, your name is Rainer, you were sent by Azazel, and you knew Issei before he arrived here? Yusaka asked. Yes. I went by a different name then, because he was only human. I was trying to keep my real identity safe, and yeah, Azazel sent me, but I came for another reason too. Came the female reply. The cold chill ran up his spine. The voice sounded familiar. No, he definitely knew the voice. It was just lower pitched. His one guess led him to believe it was Yuma, but he remembered what Drake had told him. Yuma wasn't real, she was a fallen angel, but even then, he didn't know her real name. He shook the thought away. Plenty of people shared similar voices, and besides, why would she seek him out? Well, Rainer, I understand the urgency, and I am also well aware that you want to see him for your own reasons, whatever they may be, but I must ask you to come back some other time. Issei isn't able to talk at the current moment, he is currently recovering after exhausting his magic power. Yusaka said. I understand. Sorry for the late intrusion, I was very worried about how this would all play out. I know fallen angels aren't the most liked group in this area, but would you mind if I come back tomorrow? The girl asked, her voice gentle and smooth, almost like a professional actor's. I suppose you can. I will relay it to Issei as soon as I can. I appreciate you seeking us out in a professional way. Try to do so again tomorrow when you come by. Sorry I can't offer you a place to stay, my house is rather full right now, and even if it wasn't, me welcoming a fallen into my household would surely raise some suspicion, in a lack of better words. Yusaka replied, her voice was slow, as if she was carefully thinking through how she would reply. I understand. I will return to Azazel and let him know about our talk. I will come back sometime during the day tomorrow to talk with Issei. Oh, and before I leave, I went by Yuma Amano. Can you tell him I'm sorry I wasn't able to protect him? There it was. There was a clutching sense of discomfort that formed in his chest. His mind rushed back to before. His first girlfriend. Drake told him she wasn't real, that a reason for being his girlfriend was for some other reason than what he first had thought. Anger came rushing into him, but with it came a familiar fire that burned it away. He hadn't expected her to come back. So why? And why was she wanting to apologize if the only reason she originally sought him out was because she had to? He shook his head, tears stung at his eyes when he thought back to that unfortunate day when he lost his parents. I think you should tell him that yourself. It would mean more that way, do you think? Then you can explain to him everything on your mind, and I'm sure it will help him as well. You're right. I hope he forgives me. I lied to him, but at the time I didn't want to expose him to things that could endanger him. I feel so guilty, but you're right. It's better if I tell him. I am going to head back to Azazel now. Thank you, Lady Yusaka, for being so kind and understanding. Until we meet again. There was a familiar sound of magic that whizzed, and before he knew it, the presence of the girl he once called his first girlfriend was gone. He knew it wasn't her fault anything happened to him, but it was the feeling of being lied to that made him upset. He would have to steel his emotions tomorrow when he talked to her and ask her the questions on his mind. Issei? He turned to look at the girl resting beside him. She stirred awake and looked at him with her big violet eyes. I was so worried about you. He was going to respond to her, but her next action surprised him and silenced him. She crawled towards him, her eyes half-lidded as she was still almost asleep. She laid down beside him and rested her head on his chest. She moved under the covers next, and his heart raced in a way that made his head feel like exploding. It's just like when we were younger. She said, he had completely forgotten. When they were both younger and had sleepovers, they would always sleep together. At the time, he didn't think anything about it, it was normal, but he remembered the one reason they did it on those cold nights in the middle of winter. The bed is warmer with two of them, her breathing slowed, and she fell the rest of the way into sleep. He laid there, his mind wandering as his heart pounded with nervousness from the unfamiliar situation. The day was crazy. Too complex for him to even begin to comprehend. It started with fireworks, he was reunited with his childhood friend, he was able to practice and use magic, then he met Merlin in spirit. Now he was expecting his fake girlfriend to visit him tomorrow, and his childhood friend who he hadn't seen in years turns out to be a girl and is now sleeping beside him. Would he ever have another day as crazy as this one? How was he even going to sleep now with her on his chest? He heard footsteps coming up to the door to the room. Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no. The doorknob turned. His mind raced, worry was engraved on his mind. The door crept open, and it was Yusaka who saw the two. Their eyes locked for only a second before a sly smile formed on her face. The door slowly closed. Yup. His day couldn't get much worse or better. Irina snuggled closer. The day dawned gloomily outside a storage building located in a barren plain. Clouds hung low in the sky, and there was no sunrise as such. Gradually there was a lightening of the sky, but the heavy clouds made it a morbid light. It was a befitting morning for what was about to be done inside the building. War would be waged on something that was avoidable, and an army would be formed from deceit. Sir, the magicians you've requested are all waiting for your arrival. A voice chimed through a long white-walled hallway. Very good. Deliver to me the book, scribe. I feel as though it has changed. As you wish, Master Wizard. And with that, the source of the voice turned and left, leaving a single figure alone in the central hallway that was used as cold storage for magical items that had been found throughout history. Many of them had been long forgotten, lost to time. The central hallway in question was the ground floor level of the arcane sanctuary, known as the Underground Complex. The complex was being used as the hub for magicians across the world, but until only about a month ago, the inhabitants were very minimal. It was a teaching place of magic, gifted only to humans who showed special connections to magic, either through blood or some other supernatural means. The level used for storage was obviously closer to the surface. The original intent was clearly for vehicles or machinery of some kind. The corridor was easily 200 feet long, with white louvered garage doors running the length of it, 30 per side. There was a pristine beauty to it if you were into symmetry and the vanishing point, that optical illusion that makes a pair of infinite-seeming parallel lines appear to intersect far on the horizon. If you were, then this place would be a white-walled, floored, and ceilinged heaven, but if you weren't, the point at which the lines met did gold in showing how vastly large the complex really was. And if you were him and had to walk that hallway and a few others like it a dozen times or more every single day and night to protect your most precious magical items, all while trying to prevent your own spot of power from vanishing at the reappearance of a spirit your ancestors killed hundreds of years ago, his job was quite simply explained as a struggle, and beyond even that it was boring as shit. But tonight, he was walking with a purpose. He was forming a group, so to speak. He needed more people to send after the one child that threatened his own existence and the existence of magicians as whole. He needed more pawns. Why did he need a lot of people? It may have been preposterous to form a fighting group against one singular individual, but the individual in question turned out to be the anomaly of the past few hundred years. The next question he needed to figure out while walking this long hallway towards the elevator at the other end, impossibly far away, was, how would he get them to fight? Maybe the answer was simpler than he imagined. The boy, whose name glowed in the blank pages of Merlin's book, right where Merlin's had once been, was a threat to their ability to use magic. If the boy gets the book, or even worse finds out that he had something to do with the death of his parents, the carnage would be unstoppable. Not even to mention he was the Red Dragon Emperor. He needed an army to kill the boy, and fast, and as long as the book was linked to him, he would always know where to search for him. The elevator doors slid open, revealing an entrance that hid extremely well from eyes. The only evidence of it being an elevator was the control panel and the very slight creases that made the entryway. He walked in and looked at the panel as the door closed behind him. The panel read ground floor, and below that were buttons each labeled differently. Sub-basement 1 was supposed to be the only sub-basement, and it had never occurred to any normal passerby to question the need for the number. SB1 looked just fine on the elevator keypad, just as good as any other non-conspicuous number. The facility's history as a government installation wasn't a secret when his parents bought it long ago, so finding out there had once been other, lower levels wouldn't have been much of a surprise had he ever been bothered to think about it, but to find out there were 3 of them. And they were connected by an elaborate series of sensors and alarms to a single control panel that had been poorly walled off. He was ecstatic, but even then, the ground floor level was built long after the base was occupied by civilians, leaving it disconnected from the rest, while making it the worst place in the whole complex to store his magical artifacts, but they were there regardless. The elevator moved down, with not a single lurch in another direction. The reason for this was because the elevator in question ran on a series of cogs and chains, rather than hydraulics. These elevators were meant to haul armored vehicles up and down thousands of times and do it without any problems. He went down for what seemed like less than a few seconds, and the doors rolled open. Stepping out, he was on a raised platform that looked down on a series of tables and chairs, and more than that, almost every chair was filled with a stranger's face. It was a good turnout. As he moved closer to the edge of the platform, the chatting voices began to disperse and fall into a silence. Wasting no time at all, he began his explanation for them being here. Long ago, the founder of magicians, legendary wizard Merlin, broke the rules of magic and discovered how to harness the arcane arts. Shortly after his war with the Anglo-Saxon invaders, he created us magicians, bestowing upon us his knowledge of magic. However, Merlin, as wise as he was susceptible to lust for power. This is the story we all know. This is the story we have been taught. Many voices grew in the crowd, each for only a few seconds, as if a parley of ideas had been roused. They silenced once again as the sound of the elevator coming down echoed. Seeing the very things he created grow equal to him in strength, we can assume he grew afraid of his students' progress and sought to eliminate them as such. He lured his students to the secluded mountains of England, forcing the students to believe they were on a dangerous journey to keep them close together. It was then that Merlin turned, attacking his students. Forced to fight back to save their lives, his students eventually won by burying him under a mound of rocks that we know today as Marlborough Mound. Before anyone could intervene or even share their ideas, he continued, just as the door behind him to the elevator opened behind him. So, why am I telling all of you this? To put things bluntly, the spirit of Merlin has been reborn, but not just a normal rebirth, he was reborn as the host of the Welsh dragon. We are all endangered of losing everything we have come to know, so I ask you all for your aid in the battle that is soon to come. If you want to leave, then I don't blame you, but that won't stop any of us from being hunted. We are stronger in numbers. History has proved this. Thank you for your time and consideration. From behind him, his trusted scribe walked up to him. The crowd began to talk, but none rose from their chairs. In a whisper, his scribe informed him of something urgent. Sir, it would appear, the object located inside storage container number 2 has gone missing, and here is the book from container unit 1, as requested. Thank you. He turned and took the book. How had he been unfortunate enough to hire that damned Italian monster of a mercenary in the first place? Perhaps it was because he trusted he would accomplish the job the first time. He, however, wasn't expecting the damnable mercenary to play with his prey, and it was just his luck that the mercenary met his match at the might of the Red Dragon Emperor, and even more lucky that every damned supernatural of the area managed to get their hands on the body. But not just any supernatural, no. It had to be Yasaka. He knew he was in deep. There was no way he could face the might of Yasaka, and even if he didn't get involved, the power of the Red Dragon. He was, simply put, screwed, and not only that, the staff was now in the possession of the boy as well. He hoped the boy wouldn't figure out how to use it, but there was a sneaking fear that bellowed on his back. After all, that staff was one of the most powerful objects he had. Each container was labeled 1 through 60, with number 1 being the strongest and most influential. The staff in question was interesting, not only in its power, but in its ability to transform into objects with ease. He opened the book, and on the first page, where Merlin's name had once been, was a name that still made him nervous to read aloud, almost as if saying it too many times would make the giant terror appear. Issei Haidu, the Red Dragon Emperor and the new master of wizardry. The destructive force of God paired with the ability to use every element plus some. He closed the book. He needed to be patient. He needed the people in front of him, even if it meant lying to them. Chapter 9, I Forgive You. He awoke with a subtle stir, but he felt different this time. He felt warm, and there was a new pressure that was resting on his chest. He was also holding an object close to him, warmer than a pillow, and just as soft as one in certain areas. His eyes made contact with what he held onto, and he felt nervous as blood rushed to his head. Irina filled his sight, her head resting on his chest with her eyes closed and mouth slightly agape. Her arms wrapped him in a tight hug that kept him in his place. He moved his left hand, taking it off her back, causing her to make a noise that very much resembled a moan. He attempted to move his right hand, but he realized all too late that that feat was going to be harder than he imagined it would. She was positioned in a way that pinned his arm below her, stopping him from moving any more and further past that his hand held onto her soft ample butt. The soft flesh melded between his fingers as he squeezed slightly, trying to figure out what to do in his current predicament. The girl made a cute noise and snuggled closer into him. Issei, the girl moaned out, her speech was low and steady. Was she dreaming about him or something? He shuffled slightly, moving his legs to try and break free of her grasp on him, but his right leg met resistance. He moved his head slightly to get a better look and immediately discovered that Irina had straddled his leg between her own, and him moving his leg in an attempt to move only did good in pressing his leg further up and in between her legs. This time he was dangerously close to making contact with her lady asset. And the black skin tight leotard she wore was almost equal to her skin, and to be honest, the leotard didn't make her any less soft as she pressed closer to him, but it did make him feel more nervous at the closeness they had. Issei moved his right hand away off her bottom, which seemed to cause her instant discomfort as she began to stir from her slumber. Where did the warmth go? Her eyes shone in the dimly lit room, but the amethyst color was deep and full. Her face looked peaceful and serene as she still rested her head on his chest with her half-lidded eyes. She rested her head and a slight red tint on her face, and as soon as she locked eyes with Issei, the rest of her face lit up to match the color. She lifted herself up slightly so that her upper body was above Issei, propped up with her arm on each side of him. She looked down and assessed her situation. Specifically, she looked at the limb she had trapped between her legs and immediately jumped up, fumbling over herself in the process. Good morning. Issei began, trying his best to not let his nervousness show through his voice, but she didn't fare as well. Issei. I'm sorry. I must have passed out and done this while I was asleep. I didn't mean to, she stuttered out, just as the door in the room opened. Both of them turned and made eye contact with Yasaka, who smiled widely at the duo. Issei felt a strange feeling below within Irina. It was an emotion that he could just feel radiating off of her in waves, and for a second, he knew that she knew why they ended up like that. Irina had done it on purpose, even if she was half asleep. But for Yasaka, the scene was quite something to walk in on indeed. Irina was propped over Issei, with her hand and legs on each side of him, like she was pinning him down to do something naughty, and the expression that graced Irina's fit the exact appearance of a girl who looked like she was caught in the act. My, I wasn't expecting this to happen, especially so early into your reunion. Perhaps you two were closer than friends before. Of course, Yasaka was joking, and her eyes and laughter made it obvious that she was, but her joke did good in embarrassing both Irina and Issei. Irina lit up even more, if it was possible, and Issei green red as well. He smiled widely, almost by instinct, which only made his cheeks more red. Well, come on when you two are done with business. Breakfast is ready, the rest of us will be waiting. With that, Yasaka turned and left the two alone in the room, closing the door behind her. Yasaka knew what had happened between the two, she would have done the same thing if Irina hadn't beaten her to it. She knew that the girl missed Issei greatly, and being reunited with him, only to see him shortly pass out from exhaustion only made her want to be there with him, and for him even more. She understood because it was how she felt as well, she wanted Issei to be happier, she wanted him to open up more to her. She wanted to be a mother figure, but it was becoming impossible. He simply didn't see her as one, he was still the boy she had gathered information about, and the way he ogled her sometimes did good in confirming that. She had started to lie to herself throughout the day, telling herself that she wasn't attracted to him, but it was wrong, and she knew it. She sighed a heavy breath. If she was going to get engaged in a game for his affection, she would have tried harder, she would have taken precautions to ensure her victory, but no. It wasn't about her. Making it about her went against everything she had done for him up to this point. She wanted him to be happy. She wanted all of the hardships that Issei had experienced to leave him with only gifts. He deserved happiness more than any of them. She tried to relate to him, but her sad reality was that she couldn't. In truth, how could she relate to him? She had been formed from the thoughts of people who needed the protection of someone like her. Of course, she had seen the results of war, and of course she had lost people she had grown close to, but the sad reality was, she never had parents to mourn the loss of, so how could she understand him, and what even gave her the right to try and take his true mother's place? She was out of her depth. She felt tears sting at her eyes and threatened to escape as she turned and began to walk back to where her daughter and Zenobia were waiting. She hardly even remembered how she came into her existence, and her memory of it was even more confusing than the most complex puzzle. The more she thought about it, the more confusing it became, and in her deepest thoughts, there arose doubt as to where they began at all. For a few seconds only in her deepest thoughts regarding her existence, it was something she couldn't fully understand, a feeling that time was stretched out endlessly behind her, while at moments it was only possible for her to focus on her present self. As if she was isolated to a single point of her life, she felt like the only oddity in a gray, formless infinity. She was lonely. She came to exist for war, to defend her people from enemies both foreign and domestic, but despite it all, she didn't understand at the time, so she carried on as usual, doing what she felt she was supposed to do. What she knew she was supposed to do, without ever being told. Long after the wars involving her people had been fought, she was left with a void, where she knew something should have been, but wasn't. She was bored. She was forever bound to one location, and she could never go away on a vacation for long, before she needed to return to Kyoto. "Mom, is something bothering you?" The voice of Kunu chimed in her ears like an angel's, and with that, her thoughts shot to her wonderful daughter. She recalled some of her people talking about children, but at the time the thought of having a child was so far-fetched that it was only a thought. A mere want, but regardless, she had no other way to spend her time. So, she watched her people raise their children, watched them grow, and she tried to learn everything she could. She watched how they grew up, learned what people they became, and why. She watched and watched for hundreds of years, learning, and then the lengths she went to just to make Kunu a reality. She smiled at her precious daughter. "I'm wonderful, my dear. I'm just deep in thought." She told the full truth. She sat down at the table with Kunu and Zenobia and waited for Issei and Irina to show up. A few short seconds later, the two joined them at the table, and they began to eat breakfast once they said their thanks. Issei sat beside her, and Irina sat beside her friend, across the table from Issei. A silence came over them as they ate, however, they all seemed to enjoy her cooking very much, including Issei, who looked to be in a state of bliss that rocked him with each swallow. It wasn't like she cooked anything too impressive, it was a simple traditional Japanese breakfast. She had prepared 6 grilled salmon cooked in finely chopped ginger, soy sauce, and a dash of finely chopped onion for additional flavor, and alongside that she served a traditional leek and potato miso soup with short grain rice, cucumbers, and a large tamagoyaki omelette. But the thing that seemed to catch the attention of Irina was the extra set of plates with food beside Issei. "What are the extra plates and food there for? Did someone not make it?" the girl asked, her amethyst orbs glowing at the question and curiosity. "Well, yes. We have a fallen angel visitor from Kuo that will be here soon, but I didn't want to wait for her to get her. She came and asked me last night after you all went to sleep to see Issei, saying she went by the name of Yuma Mano. She wants to apologize to you. You should at least hear her out, she sought you out willingly in an area where people don't like her kind." She explained, her eyes landing on Issei who locked eyes with her. "She was my no. I've not really had the chance to think about it. At first, I was angry that she tricked me into thinking she was a normal human, but I can't blame her. At the time everything would have been easier to not know, and my death, my family's death, was all out of her control. He explained. One look for Yusaka at him was all it took for her to read him like an open book. Something inside him about the girl was tearing his mind up. It was an inner conflict, and she couldn't help but wonder what it was and why it warranted his stress. She reached over and hugged him in her chest, enjoying the feeling herself, as though she had longed for the touch. It's okay, Issei. I'm here for you. We all are. Don't be afraid to tell me what troubles you, I will do my best to chase your pain away. I promise. He slumped into her as she said that. She was my girlfriend. It never struck me odd that a girl like her, even if she was forced to do it as a fake person, would decide to ask a person like me out. When I awoke in the hospital, that was burning around me, the thought of still having one person left to go back to was enough to keep me going, but Drake told me the truth about her, and it was like my life had been shattered. There was no one to go back to. Isaka's eyes went wide, and she suddenly had the situation dawn on her terribly. What exactly had she done? She invited the girl into her house because she wanted a word with Issei, and not only that, one of the convincing reasons she granted her permission was because she had orders from Azazel. How could she have been so careless? Her actions were going to lead Issei into a slough that he was already digging out of. Her thoughts were entirely on Issei, but the others in the room were almost as shell-shocked as her. Issei continued talking, not giving her the chance to speak. I don't feel like that anymore though. I know I have people, I have you, I have everyone here. I guess I'm just thankful. Yes, that's it. I'm thankful for you and everything you've done for me. I can't even begin to put into words how thankful I really am to you, and as for you, thank you again. Afterthought, I feel like I need to speak to her again, to clear the past, I guess. Issei, you don't have to thank me. I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. She said. Irina stood and moved beside him, embracing him in a hug as well. There was a knocking noise that resonated in the kitchen. Yusaka looked down at Issei once again, but instead of seeing some sad expression, she only saw one of happiness. He was strong-willed. At least, she hoped it was that and not the dragon suppressing his feelings, but how would she know? I guess she is here. I will be right back, okay Issei, she said, standing from her spot and making her way to the door she knew the fallen angel waited behind. She should have considered telling the girl to come at a later time, but she was thankful that her guards told her she was here as she entered her territory, so she could properly welcome her regardless. If she knew of some of the things she had done to Issei beforehand, she would have refused her request to visit the boy, but she supposed it all worked out in the end. She opened the door, and the girl that waited was dressed in a short black dress with a small light purple jacket worn over top of it. She was dressed like she was ready for a date. Yusaka stepped aside, allowing the girl access into her home. I prepared a spot for you at our table for breakfast, though we went ahead and ate. Oh, thank you very much, Lady Yusaka. I'm honored to be treated so kindly. The girl said as Yusaka closed the door behind her. Her heartbeat in her chest was harder than she could have imagined. She was afraid of her situation. She was about to approach the boy she couldn't protect, and she was in the presence of someone vastly stronger than her. She couldn't help but feel like one wrong move or slip-up would surely result in the end of her life. She wasn't an important tool for the future of her kind, so she had nothing to barter with for her life if Yusaka wished to attack her. She followed Yusaka through the hallways of her house until they eventually met Issei. She stared at Issei and felt sadness wash over her. He had been through so much pain, and she failed to protect him from any of it. She tried to keep her composure, she wanted to throw herself at him and apologize, but she didn't want to be too pushy. Issei began, falling to her hands and knees in a pleading motion. I'm so sorry, Issei. I'm sorry I wasn't able to protect you. I'm sorry I lied to you about who I was and what I was. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Nothing that happened to me was your fault, and it's okay, I understand why you lied. The more I think about it, the more sense it makes. You did it all to protect me, right? Lying to me to protect me, getting close to me to protect me. It wasn't your fault things happened the way they did. She felt an emotion below inside her that she wasn't used to. Issei had every right to be mad, he had every right to lash out at her, but instead, he smiled at her widely and told her it wasn't her fault. She was speechless. Yusaka moved past her and sat down at the table. She gestured over to the empty spot at the table beside Issei, signaling her to sit. She moved from her spot in her knelt position and sat beside Issei. There was food that was clearly hers, but she couldn't bring herself to eat it. She wanted to speak up, she wanted to continue where she left her original sentence off, but she didn't know how to continue. The silence that pressed her forced to think of something to break it, fast. Issei, regardless. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lied to you. I would like to start over with you. As friends, if possible. She said, being friends gave her the chance to fulfill her mission and mend the feeling that she held inside her heart at his death. You know? Drake was the one who told me what you were. He told me inside that hospital as it was burning down around me. I won't lie. I hated you for it. I hated myself for believing something so stupid. I guess he was right about you having alternate reasons to meet with me, but that's alright now. Because, if you didn't care and you were only here for your mission, you wouldn't be apologizing. She opened her mouth to speak in reply, but the words couldn't form. She looked like a deer in the headlights. And besides, I can sense how you are feeling right now. I don't even know how I do it, but it's like I feel what you are feeling. I know you feel sorry, truly, and I know you blame yourself still, even after what I said, and for that, I forgive you. She smiled and choked back the urge to cry from her happiness at how well her situation had gone. She shifted and hugged him, and he hugged her back. She moved away from him after the short embrace, not wanting it to become awkward. Boo, I didn't think that could get any more awkward, honestly. We were all just sitting here as you two made up, I mean wow. Now that it's over, we can be normal again. Mom, can I please have more food? Kunu said, laughing as she talked. I agree. It was really good, Lady Yasaka. I would love to have some more. Zenobia said as Irina nodded her head. Your food really is awesome, could you teach me how to cook like that? Irina asked, a tint of red forming on her cheeks. Well, since today is a special occasion, I suppose I can prepare some more and I'll gladly teach you, Irina. I might just even let you cook Issei's food yourself. Yasaka said, with a wide smile that caused Irina to light up and look down into her lap. Yasaka stood and Irina followed shortly after, but stopped as Rainer spoke to her. Yasaka, thank you for the food. Thank you for this opportunity. The fallen angel said, bowing to her. Don't worry about it. You're welcome back here at any time. Yasaka said, turning and smiling at her. She wouldn't be so nice or welcoming, but if Issei was on her side, she was as well, and she felt no ill intentions from the girl, regardless. She turned and left into the kitchen with Irina. She was going to enjoy teasing this girl about Issei for at least 10 minutes. As Rainer bit into the food, the closest thing she could relate to it too was the breakfast she would always have when she was still a normal angel in heaven. She would have breakfasts all the time like these, and she had only just begun to realize how nice they were and how much she missed them. Since she fell, she had managed to skip most every breakfast, and when she did have breakfast, it was hardly anything with sustenance, just enough to help her get a head start on her day. She savored each bite as if it was her last meal. She turned and looked at Issei. He smiled at her, and she felt her chest begin to burn. Let's all be good friends now, alright? How long had it been since she had anyone say that to her and mean it? Once she fell the first time, a majority of her life was spent wandering and being alone. Until she met Azazel, who took her in for the sole reason alone that he didn't have many allies, but even then he had his reasons to take her. She had a purpose for him, and all she wanted was to impress him, but Issei welcomed her again. Even after everything had happened, and he wanted nothing in return. Sometimes she hated being fallen. She didn't mean to fall, she just hung out with the wrong people, and once they fell she was drugged down with them, but sometimes, falling wasn't bad. It allowed her to be more honest with herself, and Issei had just made her day. She smiled at him brightly. Let's all be great friends. Once the company had eaten their breakfast, Yasaka led the group outside so she could form a training regimen for Issei to help him learn more about his magic and what it was he could do with it. She was fast inside of her thoughts, thinking of a way to make his affinity to magic stronger. She knew she needed to train him in physical ways, just as well as spiritual ways, but she didn't know what would be best, or if they would even work for him, seeing as he was a dragon. Maybe he didn't need anything at all, and she was overthinking. Regardless, she noticed something was different in the barrier that she had around her house. The sun was low in the eastern sky, just slightly cresting the trees that hid her house. There was a steady breeze that caused the leaves to rustle around them. The air was cold, too cold for her comfort, almost unnaturally cold since the previous night was warm. There was a peculiar smell that she had come to know from instinct as well. It was the smell of rain that filled the cold air around them. She looked at the sky again, and there wasn't a single cloud in sight. She turned and looked at the 4 people that followed her. Rainer had given her farewells and left back to Azazel. They didn't seem to acknowledge the change in air as she did. The chill rushed to her. She didn't like the feeling she was getting, but if there were any problems, her guards would have said something by now. Wouldn't they have? She looked into the woods, her eyes scanned the darkness between the trees around her, searching for the faintest traces of magic that could indicate to her that her guards were still, in fact, on guard. She sensed multiple figures deep between the darkness of the woods and she let her guard fall slightly. However, she couldn't think of any idea to explain the nature around her house. She turned and looked at Kunu. Kunu, does it smell a little damp for you as well? She asked her daughter. Yeah, but that's because it rained. Her daughter's matter-of-fact response. Her daughter seemed extremely sure of her answer, so how had it been that she completely managed to miss the fact that it had rained? Not even to mention it wasn't supposed to rain, and there wasn't a single cloud in sight. She sighed. She couldn't imagine how this would be an attack, and even if it was, the scale of an attack it would take to even get this far would be incredibly drawn out, and by this point, she would have figured it out. Come here, Issei, Yusaka began, deciding she should continue on with what she should have planned to test Issei's magic more. I want to see how many types of magic you can control. I know you can control fire, and we know you can mimic attacks as well, which was shown when you replicated my fox fire. This time, can you try to imagine lightning between your fingers? Issei moved forward to her and looked at her in a perplexed way for a second before he raised his hand at eye level, regardless. He closed his eyes and focused, the motion was almost like second nature by this point. His eyes shot open, and just as they did the sound of cackling filled the air. Sparks arched between his fingers at an incredibly fast rate. The sparks grew larger, eventually arching to the ground and shooting to other parts of his body. He raised his other hand, and the lighting arched between the both of them. Suddenly his hair began to spike wildly, with only the faintest signs of electricity arcing between each strand, but it was still noticeable. But perhaps the most amazing thing about the lightning, that zipped around him like a shield, was the fact that it was black and purple. The only kind Yusaka had ever seen used in magic applications was yellow, and that was mastered by Akeno Himejima, the queen of Ria's Grimory's peerage, but queens were given the means to control multiple elements from the pieces they are given. But Issei wasn't given one. She became more amazed the longer she thought about it. How would she even test the magnitude of the lightning he produced? It was simply amazing that it was colored differently at all. Looking at him, it was like he was a living, breathing plasma globe, but she refused to touch him because she held a feeling of fear and something else that only made appearance the more she thought about him. Well, we know that's 2 types of magic out of the way. 3 more to go, and then I can start working on a training plan for you. Next, let's try air. That one should be simple enough, just imagine using it to blow someone away or pin them. The difference with this one is that it will require some force in the form of an explosive movement. Try pushing your arms forward and throw a gust of wind at me. The natural wind today will be working against you because it's bellowing towards you. Yusaka explained, preparing herself for Issei's attack. She knew he was powerful, but she had enough faith in him to trust he would be gentle. Push my arms out. Alright, I'll give it a try. He pulled his arms back, doing the motions of a push-up. He tried to think about the wind rushing around him and pushing itself towards Yusaka. He paused. This was aimed at Yusaka. It was more than just a test of his abilities, it was an endurance and control test. His mind worked overtime, he needed to thrust wind towards her, but he needed to make it tame enough so she could only feel it and not get thrown back from it. He pushed his arms forward as explosive as he could muster, the force of him swinging his arms having enough momentum to pull him along for the ride, and just as his hands had started to move, wind rushed around him and began to move with his hands, flowing freely off the tips of his fingers, tingling him as it did so, and rushing towards Yusaka in a calm and idle way. He watched as the wind caused her to close her eyes, as her golden hair flowed with a gust of wind. Her hands went down to her kimono to stop it from riding up and exposing her body parts, but it didn't stop the wind from exposing her delicate legs, which instantly shot a strange feeling into his throat. Amazing work, Issei. Yusaka said with a smile that set a fire inside of him. Now, let's try earth. I'm beginning to think by this point you can use every type of magic, but we might as well test to be sure. So all around you is dirt, this one is simple, levitate a pebble of rock, erect a small wall from the dirt, try anything. Issei smiled as an idea other than the one she had proposed to him. He knelt over and placed a single hand on the ground. If he was correct in assuming earth magic was anything that was natural around him such as trees and plants, he could make a plant grow even without a seed. He imagined his favorite plant, the one he had told Yusaka about when he awoke scared at night. It was the camellia. He imagined every detail about the beautiful flower down to its petals and willed it into existence at his hand. And before his eyes, he watched a green stem appear out of the dirt and grow larger and larger. The stem began to break and grow extra limbs, slowly turning into a budding bush before everyone's eyes. Everyone watched as the bush, now about 6 feet tall and standing over Issei by a few inches, began to bud beautiful pink camellias. Hundreds of the beautiful flowers began to bloom all around the bush until it eventually stopped growing, only because Issei lifted his hands off the ground to grab one of the flowers off the bush. He twisted it in his hand as everyone had dumbstruck expressions plastered on them. They hadn't ever seen magic like that before, and even Yasaka was shell-shocked. She had never seen chlorokinesis, she had only ever read about it and been close to people who could, but never would. Creating a plant was fundamentally more complex than simply creating a wall from dirt. Creating a plant was one of the hardest psychic tests to do. It was creating a living being from nothing, and the amount of energy and power required to do something as incredible as that was extraordinary, even in the supernatural world. Only the best of the best could do it. But that confirmed her suspicions about how strong he was. The answer was extremely strong. The only thing magically that she could teach him was strategy and how to combine elements. There was no need to continue her tests with magic any further unless to help become more familiar with the elements, and there were still plenty of elements for her left to go through as well. Issei, that was amazing. You're amazing. I've never seen anything like that in person. I've only seen things like that in an anime and television series. I've heard magic like that is extremely difficult to do, even for professionals, and you just made it look like clockwork. Irina spoke, stealing the words right from Yasaka's mind. The girl ran up to him and grabbed his free hand. Yasaka looked at Issei as Irina held him, and for the first time, since she had met him, it hit her. A burning sensation rocked her body and set fire to her nether regions. She analyzed Issei closely and could feel some form of magic power secrete out of him slowly, separate from his normal magic. She felt hot as she tried desperately to keep control of her own bodily urges that hardly ever bothered her beforehand. Issei turned and looked at her, and as she stared into his eyes, the heat felt like she was going to melt. Her eyes moved to the younger girl who touched Issei, and the expression on her face looked like she was drunk from pleasure. Her cheeks were bright red, her nipples perked under her leotard, and her legs were bent inwards at an angle that spoke the world to Yasaka, and then she came to understand her situation. The girl let go of Issei and looked down at the ground, pressing her arms together, unconsciously pushing her assets out more for Issei's viewing pleasure. I'll be right back, I've got to go. To the restroom, the girl turned and darted off inside the house without looking back once, and she moved as fast as her legs would allow her. Yasaka knew then it was time to go shopping for clothes for them all, because this was going to become problematic, fast. As the sun rose fast in the sky, she began to feel strangely hot, and the humid air wasn't helping her cool down any. But she knew better than to think the liquid that oozed down her leg was sweat, and it smelled different. She looked past Issei and looked at her daughter, Zenobia. She hoped to the gods above her that she wouldn't see her own daughter going through the heat flashes of horniness, and thankful, her hopes were heard, and her daughter didn't seem to acknowledge anything that was happening at all, and beside Kunu, even Zenobia seemed unaffected. She wondered why, trying to keep herself distracted from the fact she was so very turned on right now. She tried to think of a reason why, she searched her brain for an answer, and she could only think of one answer. Issei was a dragon, so, if there came a season for dragons to mate, was he in it? Or was this something else entirely, because if he was in it, wouldn't he be feeling this as well? Her focus shifted as Issei held the flower out to her. Her confusion and worry rose to a steady panic inside her as her face stayed as straight as she could muster. She moved, taking a single step forward, feeling her sensitive thighs rub against one another. The juices that had dripped down there from her privates acted as her natural lubricant. She decided then that she was going to invest in panties next time she went out for clothes. She told her daughter to always wear them and then failed to take her own advice. How ironic was that? Once she was within touching distance of Issei, she reached out with both of her hands to grab the flower. In the process, she collapsed her hands around his. She knew she was walking paper-thin ice, but she had a theory she simply couldn't neglect testing. And behold the magic of science, her hypothesis was proven correct. Almost immediately upon skin contact with the boy, the fire in her nether regions burned in pleasure. She closed her eyes and held onto him for dear life as her legs shook below her. This was a whole new world of pleasure to her. She hadn't experienced anything like this. Not even her own hand replicated this feeling, and she hadn't done anything except touch the boy. She collected herself after a few seconds, and the pleasure had subsided but never faded away. The subtle burn continued, and she inwardly chuckled at the danger she was in. This was already so much fun. Thank you, Issei. You're just as sweet as you are, amazing. Perhaps she sounded a little too flirtatious as she took the camellia. She remembered the night he told her his favorite flower and its color. They talked about the camellia's meaning, but this one was pink. The one he said he loved was red. Maybe she was thinking too much. She held the flower closer to her chest, feeling his magic still rushing through it. She looked at the expression he gave her in response to what she said. His cheeks had become red, and she smiled wider at the revelation, taking note so she could tease him more when the time came. Her mind was being clouded by an emotion she could only assume was lust or pleasure. One of the two, but she tried her best to keep calm. She thought about how to get back to the test she was originally doing before this had all happened. Testing magic was a way to keep her distracted. She was worried what would happen if her thoughts were left to roam on their own. She needed to come up with a solution to get back on track, and fast, but the more she started thinking, the more clouded her mind became. And speaking of coming, she wondered how Irina was coming along. Was it better or worse than her? She thought of where she said she needed to go, and before she even cared to continue her own question, she already knew the answer. She didn't blame her though. She felt like she needed the release as well. She shocked herself with her own perverse thoughts. Oh okay. Next test, she said, not daring to take a step in any direction as she felt the slippery feeling between her legs get worse. Her groin was on fire. She sighed ruggedly. She needed to go to the restroom as well. Irina walked into the restroom, slipping her leotard down off her shoulders and sitting down on the open toilet seat. She felt hot in her private part, and without needing any form of confirmation, she knew that somehow, Issei was the cause of it. She had urges before, yes, but they weren't nearly as bad as this was. As she sat down on the cold surface of the toilet, her legs buckled and shook as they lost the weight of her body. She snaked her hand down her body, feeling herself as she went. She paid attention to her hardened nipples first, not sparing any time as she pinched and played with them, providing herself with small amounts of pleasure. She knew she shouldn't be doing something like this, but as far as she was concerned, she didn't figure masturbation to be a sin. It was completely natural, so why would something so natural be considered a sin? That was obscene, even if it's self-abuse to an extent. In her defense, what was she going to do? She looked down at her leotard and saw the spot she had made on the material that rode up between her legs. She couldn't possibly let that continue. This was the only pair of clothes for the time being, and it looked like she was approaching the need to get clothes, fast. She hoped Yusaka would understand and help her. But that was the least of her worries at the moment, as the heat that filled her was becoming unbearable, and the more her hands roamed the more the hot the fire burned. Taking her hands and working them up her silky smooth skin, she grabbed onto her perfectly round and spherical girls. Her firm chest and small boobs were the same fair color as the rest of her body. She attacked her supple breasts with vigor and rubbed her thighs together in anticipation to create more mind-numbing pleasure for herself to enjoy. She hoped that the others stayed outside so they couldn't hear what she was doing, since she knew silence wasn't an option for her sensitivity to pleasure. Her right hand trailed down her stomach, leaving her left to seize her left small mound of flesh and gave the flesh a firm squeeze. In her palm, she felt her hard nipple dig in and remind her what exactly she was doing, but her mind was lost in her own pleasure, staring blankly at the door she forgot to lock. Oh well, too late to fix it now. She imagined his fingers snaking down her delicate body, teasing her. She had waited far too long to touch him again. She had always thought about their reunion and what it would hold. The fire that burned in her privates made her honest with herself. She loved him. She was infatuated with him, and she knew that started when they were only kids. He was kind to her, he was kind to everyone. She was his first friend, and he was her first as well. It was both of their first days at the park where they had met and continued to meet. She felt her eyes sting slightly at the thought. She wanted to stay with him, she wanted to wake up again like she did this morning. She wanted him. She imagined her right hand being his, kneading the flesh on her chest like dough, and she loved it. She imagined him whispering how she was his in her ear. She couldn't stop herself from releasing small moans from the stimulus. It was a desiccated thing to her, but she loved it in the moment, being honest with herself. She shivered at the thought of him whispering in her ear about how naughty she was. Even the Bible acknowledged that forbidden fruits taste the sweetest. She shouldn't be doing this, but it felt so right. Her mind played a twisted mental game as her fingers were playing with her drooling labia. Horny was becoming an understatement. She wanted nothing more than for him to come in and cure her fever. She imagined doing the same tonight. This time she would rush into his room and sleep with him. Her poor face couldn't get any redder from the pleasure that she gave herself. That just wasn't enough. She pinched herself, the pleasure from the self-abuse enough to send her almost to her limit, but still not enough. She plunged her two middle fingers into her sopping opening, thrusting them in and out using her index and pinky finger to squeeze her labia, giving the highest friction her fingers possibly could give her. The palm of her hand was rubbing her sensitive spots in all the good ways, and since when did she become so good with her hands? She hadn't done this much, but it came like second nature. Ah, so big, she mumbled quietly as she increased the pace of her thrusting. Her voice squeaked silently as her fingers made short work of her snatch, imagining it was Issei thrusting into her. Her game wasn't to see how long she could last, it was a race to see how fast she could finish. She kept the vicious thrusts of her fingers, rocking her whole body on the toilet, her tongue rolled out of her mouth, and her eyes rolled back as her walls squeezed her fingers in a mind-shattering orgasm. Her juices dripped into the toilet from the heat between her legs, and her fingers were drenched. She felt guilty only a moment later as she gained her thought process back. She held her fingers up, looking at her clear honey that coated them. It was so wrong of her, but she thought of how it would taste, and couldn't help but bring it up to her lips in the spur of the moment as pleasure still filled her mind. She swished her smooth tongue between her two middle fingers, tickling herself as she lapped up her own juices. She had played herself though, as soon as she did this act, the fire began to burn hotter than before. She felt like an animal in heat, and in the literal sense she was. She couldn't do it again. She couldn't, but her hands began to move on their own. She started her motions again. Her moan was loud and very audible. She shook at the feeling of her fingers working magic once more. She was far more sensitive this time. She tried to suppress her moan by biting her bottom lip, but since she refused to hurt herself, the moans escaped through her lips only slightly muffled. "Oh my Issei," she moaned, trying to keep her voice down as much as she could. It was futile though as her lips betrayed her with each thrust. Many times, she was able to suppress her moans to a hum, but it was never silent, nor were they quite hums. Her legs tingle and shake more with each consecutive thrust to her extra sensitive and soaked womanhood. If this was what her hands felt like, she wondered what his tongue would feel like. She wondered what his manhood would feel like, going into her from the front like her fingers, in view so she could see. She knew her fingers were a poor representation of what his thing could do to her. Why was she thinking things like this? Was she an inner pervert? Was she going to have to embrace and accept that she is a pervert behind everything she has made herself to be? She reached her climax once again. This time her body lurched forward, her legs squeezed her hand in place as she began to rock back and forth, each movement a representation of a wave of blissful pleasure shooting her body to the closest thing her material body could get to heaven. Once her body was done sending her to a higher plane, she leaned back on the toilet. She breathed in the smell that had filled the room and closed her heavy eyes. She supposed she should have hurried up or just stopped while she was ahead of herself. The fire was gone from her privates, but there was another feeling that came as she heard a noise at the door. It was a steady knocking, 1, 2, 3, and then there came a voice that belonged to Yusaka, asking her when she would be done having fun. The feeling she held now was embarrassment. After cleaning her leotard with the wipes that lay on a table beside her and also wiping herself, she stood and pulled her leotard back over her shoulders, moving the piece around with her fingers to adjust the right material to her skin. After that, she moved to the sink with and washed her hands, drying them with the towel that hung from a mount on the wall to her left. She stepped out of the door and immediately met with Yusaka, who looked at her with a sly smirk. Her face turned red. "It's okay. I felt it too. I probably have it worse than you, actually. We will go shopping after this. Immediately. Issei should get out and get to know my lands, and it will be a good break," Yusaka said, walking past her and making her way into the bathroom. She didn't know how to feel about her doing that after she had just done it, but her worry was immediately replaced with confusion as she heard water running from the shower inside the bathroom. If she remembered correctly, it was one of the special rain shower heads that was attached close to the ceiling. She had read about those kinds of showers. They were different from conventional shower heads because they were designed to give the experience of showering in the rain. They had many settings that could be adjusted to get the feeling of drenching rainstorms to a nice trickle of droplets instead of streams shot from small jet-like nodules. Her thoughts shifted again. Why hadn't she thought of taking a cold shower to help quail her heat? She shook her head shortly at the thought though. She didn't have clothes. She moved, deciding it would be best to wait for her outside with Issei, Kunu, and Zenobia. She moved down the hallway towards the way she had come and moved her way to the exit, but she was met with the sight of everyone just walking inside. "Hey Arena. Yusaka wanted us to come in and wait for her to finish her shower so we could go to the neighboring town. I'm kind of excited to get out. I haven't left the house or the area around the house since I've got here," Issei said, smiling at her widely. She felt the blush return to fullness and looked down at her feet as she fumbled with her hands nervously. She couldn't help herself, knowing what she had just done to perverse thoughts of him. "She told me just as she walked and that I look forward to getting more clothes to wear as well. This rubber leotard that was given to us is getting unbearable. I wonder if Yusaka would have anything I could change into now?" Irina asked, more to herself than to anyone. "We have kimonos that you could wear over that. If you want, I can go get you two," Kunu said, looking quizzically at Irina and Zenobia. "I would be very thankful," Irina replied. Kunu walked off, leaving Irina in her thoughts about Issei. Irina looked at him, dressed in a black silk kimono with gold designs on it that were sharp and aggressive. It looked more like a pajama or bathrobe set, but the stitching pattern favored flexibility and allowed for agile movements. They looked like some type of loose apparel for the Jinyue, the ancient Chinese imperial secret police that served the emperors as elegant assassins during the Ming dynasty. In fact, if he had the mantles and bracers along with the extremely hard to wield, patience-testing Yao Dao greatsword that rewarded prowess with devastating strikes as brutal as a samurai wielding a katana. She shook the thought from her head, as impressive of an image as that would be, but it made sense for him to learn how to use a bladed weapon. He was already so strong magically, he didn't need any training in that regard. He only really needed strategy, and that could be learned from a book or simply be taught verbally. It would be more practical to train him physically and teach him how to fight close combat in the inevitable event he was pushed by someone who attacked physically in close combat. Swordsmanship was an art, a lot like dancing, despite how gruesome it could be. Not even to mention he would need to learn martial arts beforehand. She knew that Yusaka was well aware of all of this though. She was sure she was also a skilled fighter, probably more skilled than Zenobia, and she combined. No, she was definitely more skilled than the two of them, even with magic, but anyone could see that not even she was stronger than Issei with magic, but there was the experience side of the argument as well. She wondered if Yusaka was forming a training plan including her and Zenobia. She wondered if Yusaka knew they were trained by the church in swordsmanship and magic. She was so caught up in her thoughts about Issei and how he would fight that she hadn't noticed Kunu had returned with 2 sets of kimonos that had the designs of her and her mother's Maiko outfits. "Here you go," she exclaimed with childlike enthusiasm, offering one to her as one to Zenobia. They both took one gratefully and threw them on over their leotards. The first thing that she noticed was the 5-star-shaped pentagrams that adorned each sleeve of the white kimono right at the wrist, one on her chest at her heart, and if hers was the same as Zenobia's, one on her back just below the neck collar. "Thank you very much, Kunu. You're so very sweet," Irina said to her, causing the girl to beam brighter. She heard footsteps sound from behind her. She turned and looked at Yusaka as she walked towards the group. Her hair was slightly wet and tied up into the bun she had normally seen her with. The most noticeable difference she could see was that Maiko showed less of her cleavage. As she stopped once she was close to the group and standing beside her daughter. "Are we all ready to go? I can tell Issei is, as am I," she said, giving Issei a smile. Each of them gave their answers together, all of them agreed that they were ready to leave. Yusaka nodded and walked back out the door they had gathered in, leading them all outside and to a pathway that had torii gateways along it. As they walked through the torii, Irina turned around and looked, her curiosity getting the best of her. And behind her, she didn't see the house she had left, but instead saw only a simple shrine. She was perplexed, but the more she thought about it the more it made sense in explaining what had happened when they ran into the woods at first. It was magic, which meant the last gateway was a transcendental arch that granted access to Yusaka's home, but then how did she come in through the woods? She decided it was a question for later. "Hey Issei, can I hold your hand?" It was Kunu who asked. She looked at the girl as she grabbed Issei's open hand and walked beside Yusaka. There was a pang of jealousy that came to her. She wanted to hold his hand too. She pouted to herself. Thanks for watching this video. Part 4 is over. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. And also check out the playlist that I have created and enjoy. Link is in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.